Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I want to do another breakdown of a fight that I lost. I honestly find these breakdowns to be one of the most informative for me, obviously because I can break down what went wrong in my own fencing, but I also feel like they're a really good opportunity to show other people how exactly you can look at a loss and try to learn from it in a more specific way. Because it's one thing to tell somebody that you can always learn from your mistakes, and it's another thing to be able to review footage, look at the actual mistakes, and try to blame it on yourself, more or less. So let's watch these exchanges. So for our first exchange, you're going to notice me standing with my right leg forward, which if you pay attention to some of my previous videos, you'll know that I switched out of. This is actually from before I made that switch, so just as a little bit of an explanation, but it's going to factor into part of the reason why I do so poorly. Now, in this particular exchange, my opponent eventually breaks a little bit of a stalemate by throwing a left-hand cut. It misses, I throw one back, it also misses. And then they come forward with a bit of a thrust over the top, trying to skewer into my left shoulder. I parry it off to the side and I throw a nice left Zverkow in on the opening, and everything seems to go okay. But one thing to pay attention to is what's going to really cause problems for me in the rest of this fight is, one, I'm starting way too close. If you watch the replay of when my opponent goes in, you will see just how far in they get into my range before I start to parry. I really am skirting with danger here, where it looks like the point of my opponent gets just within a couple of inches of planting itself into my shoulder, and honestly, if they had thrown it directly down the middle, there's a decent chance it would have just straight up landed. The reason I'm fencing too close is because I'm also fencing extremely aggressively. Even though I am parrying, what I'm essentially doing is staying stock still and waiting for my opponent to come in, and maybe even moving forward a little bit while I parry at the same time. Sometimes this can be a really smart thing to do, because if you step forward when you parry, you can often very easily dictate range and get very, very close to your opponent, and as long as you know what to do out of that situation, you can have a pretty distinct advantage. But, of course, the problem is that if you're moving forward while you parry, you are shortening the distance between your opponent's blade and your body, and changing up the timing so much that you might end up walking directly into cuts. Now, for the rest of these exchanges, it's worth pointing out that those were the only points that I get this entire fight, those two in the first exchange. So for the rest of these, my opponent is going to get the points for what they do. And again, I don't like to go through these and look at like the judging and say whether or not it was right or wrong. What I really want to point out here is what I was doing that made them think that my opponent landed every single time, even though sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. In this particular exchange, my opponent waits for me to kind of move forward a little bit and attempts to shield how directly into my shoulder in a kind of offset tempo. And this is a really smart thing to do, given that I was standing in the exact same guard and waiting for my opponent to try to gesture at me, at which point I try to do a kind of stepping parry forward. In this case, I do my little bit of footwork forward, I get no reaction from my opponent, and then as I'm going backwards to return to my safe position, that is when my opponent throws the shield how. It was a really good piece of timing here. And as a result, I'm kind of up against the back of the ring, so instead of taking a full step backwards, I try to lean out of the way. Now, watching the replay, it looks like I do manage to parry that thrust off to the side. Partially because it looks like it goes actually a bit underneath of my crossguard, as in it would going to try to shoot the gap between my right arm and my right bicep, and I just kind of sweep it off to the side with my hand. Now, with the thrust, that's something that you can kind of do. But if you're looking for a reason why the judge that's off camera here thought that it landed, that's probably why. There was a very reasonable chance that if I had moved even a slightly bit more forward, I would have impaled my own arm onto the thrust of my opponent, because I'm doing the stepping parry thing. And while in this particular case, it does a very good job of chasing my opponent down and throwing my left Zverkow and landing on the hands, the point here is that I am fencing in a very, very aggressive way, but starting off on the back foot, so to speak, because I'm always looking for that first parry. And again, it's going to cause me a lot more trouble coming up. So for this next exchange, again, worth pointing out that I do not get any points here, I am trying to set up the stepping parry thing again, despite the fact that it has caused me a lot of trouble. However, it was causing me trouble before because my opponent was starting to realize that I was moving in and out of range constantly, and they started attacking me while I was moving backwards. This time, I do something a little bit smarter, though it does play into the same kind of loop. I'm moving in and out of range, and I'm trying to bait my opponent into coming forward at a range that isn't appropriate, which means that they would overextend themselves in order to try to hit me. My opponent is not falling for this bait, which means that eventually I stop pretending to move forward and I actually move forward. But when I do this, I move forward and I push my opponent's blade off to my left side so that I can get them firmly out of the way and parry the thrust before it even starts. And this works out. I'm able to go up, I zwerk along the top, I miss the top of my opponent's head because I just got a little too excited, I guess, and I cut them on the inside of the arm. At which point, I then do a little bit of a back parry because I'm moving to my left, my opponent is moving to their left, which means we're kind of circling around each other, and as he throws a left cut, the only way for me, after landing this right zwerk, to cover my right line is to move it back towards my right while I'm moving to my left, aka I go from here to here, and I parry my back. I do actually manage to get this parry off. However, the judges declared that because I had to do this parry, I was actually defending the back of my head, which meant I exposed it, which means they gave my opponent the full points for hitting me in the back. They just sort of thought that my first Zwerk missed, and in fairness, it did. It did miss the head. It just kind of landed on the inside of the arm. But the real purpose of breaking this down is to show that now it has been 3 exchanges in a row where I have fully committed to this stepping parry technique, and it has not worked on any of these 3 ways. And the reason that I keep doing it is because, 1, I'm standing in a footwork position that heavily emphasizes this technique, but also because every time I do it, I feel like I'm doing it right, but I'm just not getting points. And that's creating a feedback loop in my head where I think, oh, well, the judges just didn't see it right. I'll get it next time. So I do it again. And then, lo and behold, the judges still see the exact same thing as they always have, and they don't give me any points. And the important thing to remember out of this is that I don't like to talk about whether or not judges get things right or wrong, primarily because as a fencer, you cannot do anything to control what they see and what they call. Which means the only thing you can do is adapt not only to your opponent, but to your judges. If you think that you're getting the best of an exchange, but the judges don't agree, the last thing you need to be doing is doing it over and over again, harder or faster or stronger, in the hopes that they see it this time when they haven't seen it before. Now, this next exchange doesn't actually contain any stepping parries from me, but it does have the exact same kind of footwork setup that we saw in the previous exchange. I'm moving in and out of range constantly, waiting for my opponent to basically show me what they want to do. Every time I move into range, they start to move their hands into a position where they want to defend themselves with an attack, and I say, okay, that's what they're going to want to do. Now I have to do the kind of stepping parry or stepping defensive action that's going to counteract that. It's not necessarily a bad plan. However, what we see happen is we go back and forth on a little bit of an exchange, and my opponent starts to move all the way out of range in order to reset and kind of de-stress. And as I'll say in previous videos, this is an absolutely perfect opportunity to throw an attack on somebody. However, in this particular instance, my opponent had already moved out of range. So I use an attack, what I call a delayed attack. You basically start walking forward directly into range, although you're not in range yet, and you show your opponent that you're going to attack them. And one of 2 things happens. Either they start going into a defensive posture, which is 90% of the time what happens, or they immediately try to counterattack. The idea here is that because I'm gesturing that I'm going to attack, but I'm not actually in range yet, if my opponent counterattacks, I'll be able to parry it. If they become defensive, then I wait for myself to get into range, and then I throw my actual attack, generally along a different line than what I was gesturing. And in this case, I do exactly that, although my opponent does a really, really great job of not falling for my gestured attack and then doing a great job of parrying my follow-up. And the problem here was that the delayed attack that I did was just way too simple and way too obvious. I come up and I put my blade up in the air, which tells my opponent I'm going to go high for a deep target, and then I just sort of lower it a little bit and throw an exact same 45-degree angle cut along the left line towards the hands, which, as you see here, was parried by the exact defense that my opponent showed me. What this tells me is that my delayed attack was not successful because the mix-up that I tried to pull didn't actually mix anything up. I came forward, I gestured that I was going to be aggressive, my opponent showed me that he was going to be defensive, and I just threw an attack directly into their defense, at which point they parried it and came straight down the middle into my head. And Now, the judges didn't actually see this happen at the time, so they didn't call halt, which meant that I, took my opportunity. I pushed it off to the side. I threw a follow-up cut. But just to be clear, my opponent did get the points for that cut to the head, which they deserved. Now, if you want to learn from this a little bit, what you have to realize is that doing this kind of delayed attack action always requires a mix-up from a completely different quadrant. And now, in this case, I went from going high on my left side to kind of just middle on my left side. It would have made it a lot more sense if I went high on my left side and low on my right side. Or, high on my left side and high on my right side. Any real mix-up would have probably worked here, and as you can see, it's just the one thing that I didn't do, and it's the reason I wasn't successful. So I skipped an exchange here primarily because it got thrown out and no points were awarded, but also because I want to really showcase this exchange as the final exchange, and as a final nail in the coffin of what was so wrong with my entire game plan going out through this fight. This entire time, I have been using feinted footwork to move into range and then back out of range. And the idea is that when I move into range, if I'm fast enough, I can start moving backwards as soon as my opponent starts to attack. And theoretically, this works great. It also means that every time I move forward and my opponent gestures something as some kind of attack or defensive action, I can know, okay, that's what they're thinking about doing. I can respond to that and adapt to that. And again, a great idea. But the problem and the major flaw here is that if it's too much of a pattern, what your opponent can now realize is that every single time you move your feet forward, you're moving them without a threat. And when there's no threat and you move into range, the one thing you can simply do is hit them. And that's exactly what my opponent does here. I move my feet into range, my opponent just comes forward and hits me. And the reason it works is because they hit me exactly as my lead foot was hitting the ground. You can see that my back foot is off the ground, which means it's not pushing me forward anymore. And now I'm trying to push with all my might backwards, and it's just not enough. He timed my footwork perfectly, and he simply did the obvious counter to this three-step process that I was trying to do with his one-step process. It's a really great thing that you can pay attention to in your own fencing, because there are a lot of people who do what I do here. They bounce around a lot. They move around a lot. They constantly move in and out of range. And if they're smart, they're doing it to try to get the download on your offensive and defensive options. But even if they're smart about it, you can always use it as a great indicator that they move into range without a threat. And it's a perfect opportunity for you to get a clean shot on somebody who maybe you think has better footwork than you. It's a really great option, and one that my opponent deserves his points for, and in my opinion, despite the fact that there were maybe some questionable calls in this, one that he deserved to win. So, if you're ever watching your own footage and you see stuff like this, what do you do about it? Well, lucky for me, I've already kind of made the adjustment for this. This is primarily the reason why I started taking my right flag and putting it backwards, because it forced me to stop doing this kind of footwork, and two, it stopped me from doing these kinds of stepping parries. As you know from watching the video where I talk about why I switch my stance, I primarily do it because I was trying to turn myself into a more aggressive fencer when I'm just not an aggressive fencer. And rather than do anything that augmented my defense, I was trying to round myself out and force my right leg forward so that I would be more offensive and then take advantage of the defense that I already had. I wanted to be neutral, and instead, now what I do is I take that right leg, I put it backwards, and I just accept the fact that I'm a defensive fighter, and sometimes people are going to walk at me, they're going to hit me for free, and I'm going to look like a fool. Because, in my opinion, it's better for me to look like an idiot and miss a parry than for me to do and fight like I am in this video, where I'm just constantly walking forward and then throwing a defensive option as the first idea. It's not a good combination of two concepts. While stepping parries, again, are something that you can do, the idea that I want to be offensively defensive by always walking into range, triggering a response, and then hoping that my defense is strong enough to hold up, it's just not a good game plan. So, if you're the kind of person who fences like this, hopefully you don't find myself too much of something to replicate here, because I really don't think it works out. But if you make it work, feel free to do so. And if you want to see more videos like this, I will be back next Tuesday.